I took my wife to a party, and she left with another man. It wasn't one of those exaggerated jealousy scenes where everything is blown out of proportion. No. It was silent. Painful. Precise. I saw them talking, saw her eyes change, not in color, but in intent. She looked at me as if she no longer looked at me. And when I noticed she was no longer beside me, I went looking for her. I found them both on the sidewalk, their faces too close to be mere acquaintances. When she saw me, she lowered her eyes, as if she already knew there was no excuse left. I didn't make a scene. I didn't ask anything. I just took a deep breath and said, "You chose. I choose to leave." I returned home alone. That very morning, I filed for divorce. People talk about betrayal as if it were just the act. As if what destroys were the kiss, the touch, the body. But what really hurts is the exact moment you realize the person sleeping next to you stopped loving you before you even realized it. What kills is the silence between two gazes that were once home, and now only recognize each other as strangers. And worse than being betrayed is feeling like you were the last to know the love was over, because while you were still giving yourself completely, the other was already half gone. For days, I walked through the house like someone living among rubble. Every object was a reminder. The cup she used in the morning. The perfume that still clung to the sheets. The sound of silence in the place where once there was laughter, conversation, a shared routine. They asked me if I was okay. I lied, of course. The world expects the betrayed man to be strong, silent, rational. As if our chests weren't bleeding inside. She tried to reach me days later. She texted me, called me, wrote long emails that began with, "I don't know what happened to me." And me? I was already in a different place. Not emotionally, not yet, but physically. I had moved, changed my number, silenced the past. Not for revenge. But for self-preservation. For sanity. The pain made me understand that forgiveness is an intimate choice, and that moving on, sometimes, is an act of self-love, not coldness. She was left alone. The other man just wanted one night. A body. A distraction. And when he got what he wanted, he disappeared like a ghost. No messages. No explanations. And she, who threw away an entire love for a moment of vanity, was left with the emptiness that followed. With the echo of a choice made on impulse. With the memory of someone who loved her sincerely. Time passed. Slowly, as only passes when we suffer. But it did. And with it came the unexpected, a new love. It wasn't immediate, nor overwhelming. It was light. Serene. Someone who didn't need to shout to be heard, who didn't demand daily proof of love from me, because they saw it in my actions. Someone who walked by my side with loyalty, as if understanding that true love isn't about promises, but about presence. And it was in this silent presence that I found peace again. On the other side, she kept trying to find me. She sent me updates through mutual friends, made up excuses for us to cross paths in the same places. Until one day, after a long time, we saw each other. It was brief. An almost accidental encounter. She was dejected, her eyes weary, as if she carried the guilt on her shoulders every day. She spoke of longing, of regret. I heard it all. And when she asked if there was any chance, I smiled respectfully and said, I forgave. But not to get back together. I forgave to move on. And that was when life, with its elegant irony, showed its final card. Because what she had prevented me from living, that old dream she called a waste of time, nonsense, an illusion, now, alongside another woman, I was living. And not just living, achieving, being encouraged, celebrated. What had once been a source of contention became a source of pride. She, who had once mocked my passion, now watched from afar, silently, as I built something great. And, seeing this, she understood, the love she had thrown away had blossomed in the hands of another woman. Not because I was perfect, but because now someone was watering it with truth. And that's where the true punishment lies. Not in the loneliness itself, but in the silence that comes when you realize what you lost is gone. In the gaze of the other that no longer belongs to you. In the scent of the new perfume that replaces the old. In the touch that was once yours and now cradles another story. Because betrayal, contrary to what they say, is not an abrupt end. It's a slow collapse. And worst of all, when you realize what you've done, it's already too late. Today, when I think about that day of the celebration, I no longer feel anger. I feel a strange kind of gratitude. Because it was in that abandonment that I found myself again. It was in that silence that I discovered who I was. And it was in that ending that, finally, my beginning began. But what she discovered next, what she saw unfold, years later, before her very eyes, brought everything she'd experienced with me back like a punch to the chest. Because when she saw that the dream she'd once buried, was now alive, fulfilled, and being lived alongside another, it was in that moment that she understood the true price of her choice. And what happened at that reunion was the most unexpected moment of all. Because there, in front of me, she said something she'd never said before, something that changed everything. And that's exactly where the real story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize betrayal, we unmasked her. All the stories told are fiction, but the feelings they provoke are real. Our goal is to show, without filters, how a wrong choice can destroy a true love and mark lives forever. Get ready to hear a story intense, dramatic and unforgettable. Take a deep breath, what comes next will move you. His name was Daniel. He had a calm way of occupying spaces, like someone who learned early on that the strongest presence is the one that doesn't need to impose itself. He worked in graphic design and spent hours observing shapes, lines, colors, but it was the details of people that he paid most attention to. There was something in his gaze that seemed to always be listening. A kind of kindness that made no noise, but left its mark. Perhaps that's why, when she met Laura, she sensed something different there. He wasn't the kind of man who took center stage in a room, but he was the only one she wanted to talk to amidst so many empty people. Laura was intense, direct, the kind of woman who left a trail wherever she went. Communicative, engaging, full of ideas. She worked as an event coordinator and prided herself on being able to handle crises in a matter of seconds. She was practical. Strong. And, in the eyes of many, unshakable. But deep down, she carried an old fear of not being chosen, of not being enough. A fear she never confessed. Not even to herself. The beginning was light. They met at a creative conference, the kind that brings together professionals from diverse fields. They were introduced by mutual friends, and before the evening was over, they were laughing like old acquaintances. She talked with her hands, he listened with his eyes. Laura was surprised by his calmness. Daniel was enchanted by her energy. It was as if they filled each other's gaps. In the following months, their meetings became routine. Simple dinners, long walks around the city, lazy Sundays with rewatched movies and deep conversations. All unhurried. No games. Just truth. When they decided to move in together, it was almost natural. There was no formal proposal, no ceremony. Just a Saturday afternoon when they started packing boxes, as if they already knew this would be their home. The apartment smelled of freshly brewed coffee, books stacked in every corner, and paintings Daniel painted in his spare time. Laura brought him flowers on Sundays, even if she bought them herself. They said they loved each other, but it was in everyday life that they truly declared their love. He remembered exactly how she liked her tea. She knew when he needed silence. It was a love built on reality, on sharing, on daily choices. And yet, like everything human, it wasn't perfect. Life took its toll. Work was demanding. The days flew by. Daniel began taking on new projects, taking on freelance work at night. Laura, meanwhile, climbed the career ladder at her company and spent more time away from home, organizing increasingly larger events. Little by little, their routine began to feel tight. Schedules clashed. Conversations became shorter. They still loved each other, but a weariness loomed over them both. And, without realizing it, they began seeing each other less during breaks and more during obligations. Holidays became dinners planned in advance. Spontaneous trips gave way to synchronized schedules. And yet, in everyone's eyes, they remained the ideal couple. Friends spoke of them as role models. It was common to hear comments like, "You're so compatible, you can see how much you respect each other, you're an inspiration." And, in a way, they were. The love was still there, but hidden behind responsibilities, waiting to be remembered. Daniel, always sensitive to details, began to notice subtle absences, the way Laura checked her phone during breakfast, the lack of questions about the projects he dedicated so much time to, the constant distraction, even in the simplest conversations. But he didn't speak up. He thought it was just the weight of the days. Laura, on the other hand, felt overwhelmed. She expected more enthusiasm, more presence, more initiative. She began to wonder if he still admired her. But he didn't say it either. And so, the unspoken expectations accumulated between them like dust under the rug, invisible to the eye, but uncomfortable in their footsteps. Even so, there were moments that rekindled something. Like that weekend he cooked an entire dinner alone, with candles, music, and wine, just because she'd had a rough week. Or the day she surprised him with tickets to an exhibition by an artist he'd loved since he was a teenager. In those moments, they remembered what had brought them together. And it was real. It was strong. But it was no longer enough to hold back what was silently beginning to crumble inside. Communication, which had always been one of the couple's pillars, began to falter. It wasn't arguments. It was silences. They avoided sensitive topics. They talked about the weather, commitments, the grocery list, but they no longer spoke about themselves. She smiled at dinner, but returned to her room with tired eyes. He hugged her at bedtime, but woke with the feeling that something was off. And yet, they continued. Because that's what couples do. They try. And Daniel tried. With every small gesture, every withheld compliment, every show of care, there was a desperate attempt not to lose what she still believed she had. Laura, on the other hand, was already beginning to feel the weight of doubt. A doubt she herself avoided naming, but which appeared in the reflection in the mirror, in the messages she took too long to respond to, in the discomfort she felt around someone who had once been everything. Amidst this scenario, an invitation arrived. An award ceremony for the events industry, where Laura would be honored as one of the most influential professionals of the year. Daniel would accompany her, of course. It was an important night for her, and he was proud. They spent the day getting ready, choosing their outfits, briefly reliving that light-hearted enthusiasm of yesteryear. In the car, on the way to the ceremony, they exchanged compliments and smiles. For a moment, it seemed like they were finding their way again. But not every journey leads back. At the party, Laura was greeted by everyone. She shone. She floated among the tables, glasses, and hugs. Daniel watched from afar, enchanted and a little out of place. He knew this was her world, and he respected it. But he felt that, in that place, she was someone he didn't fully know. Still, he looked at her with pride. She was the woman he loved, after all. Even when she seemed unattainable. Even when the glow she emanated seemed to no longer reach him. The night wore on, the lights grew softer, the music louder. Side conversations formed. Laughter, dancing, reunions. Laura mingled naturally, flowing from one group to another. Daniel remained discreet, greeting a few acquaintances, drinking little, observing a lot. At one point, she introduced him to a coworker. An elegant man, with an easy smile, a direct gaze. They chatted briefly. Daniel didn't notice anything strange, but something in her tone seemed lighter than it had in weeks. As if, for the first time in a long time, she was relaxed. It bothered him subtly, almost imperceptibly. But he swallowed the discomfort. It wasn't jealousy, he told himself. It was just a feeling. They returned home late. Laura spoke excitedly about upcoming projects, the praise she'd received, the connections she'd made. Daniel listened, smiled, and supported her. As he always did. That night, they slept in each other's arms. And for a moment, he believed everything was still in place. He didn't know, of course, that her heart was already wandering in another direction. And that, in the same scenario where he saw possibility, she saw doubt. The routine continued for the next few days. With promises of more time together, attempts to recapture their moments together. But there was something between them that could no longer be ignored. Something growing slowly, like a crack in thick glass. Invisible at first, until it became impossible to repair. And Daniel, even without knowing exactly what it was, felt it. He felt. But he loved. And those who love, sometimes, choose not to see what their heart is already screaming. Laura didn't know exactly when it started, but it did. It wasn't an outburst, an abrupt fall, a miscalculation, or an overwhelming passion like in cheap movies. It began with fatigue, with a distracted gaze, with the silent feeling that something was missing. She tried to resist at first, tried to redouble her attention at home, to be more affectionate, more present, but soon realized she wasn't trying for love anymore, she was trying out of guilt. She tried because she knew Daniel deserved nothing less. She tried because, even though she already felt an internal distance, there was a part of her that still respected him. But respect isn't love. And Laura, little by little, allowed herself to slide along the fine line between admiration and the desire to feel alive again. Over time, the messages he once sent Daniel with photos of his daily life began to cease. His cell phone became a more intimate and confidential territory. Passwords changed. Extended workdays became a regular occurrence. And the enthusiasm with which he spoke about events was now charged with a different energy, a vibration Daniel recognized but couldn't name. That change in tone, that subtle smile after meetings, that sparkle in his eyes when he talked about new partnerships, it all made him uneasy. He was never jealous, never needed to be, because they had always trusted each other. But what began to eat away at Daniel wasn't jealousy, it was intuition. And this, however silent, always spoke louder than words. The house was silent in the mornings and late afternoons. When they were together, they seemed like two actors in a rehearsed script: good morning, good job, sleep well. No direct confrontation, no violent arguments, just absence. Daniel, inside, was beginning to fall apart. He wondered if he was going crazy, if he was seeing things where there was nothing, if he wasn't projecting an old fear onto Laura. But each day was a confirmation. She avoided looking him in the eye for long periods of time. She refused subtle touches, excusing herself from fatigue. Her responses were short, matter-of-fact, as if he were a roommate. And even when they were alone, there was a presence that occupied the space between them. A third element that didn't speak, but shouted. Daniel began to observe her more closely. Not out of distrust, but out of desperation. He tried to understand if there was still any trace of the woman he'd fallen in love with. Laura was still beautiful, elegant, professionally shining like never before. But she was absent. She was far away. And, without him asking, the answers began to come. One afternoon, when he returned early from an appointment, he found her perfume different. A scent he'd never smelled before. When he asked, she said it was a sample she'd received from a colleague. The next day, the bottle was missing from the bathroom shelf. Another time, she'd forgotten her phone on the table, and when a notification lit up the screen, Daniel saw a name he didn't recognize. A brief, direct message that left no room for doubt: same time today. He said nothing. He remained silent like someone harboring a pain. It was as if you were waiting for an inevitable confirmation. But confirmation didn't come in words. It came in gestures. One weekend when they'd planned to visit his family, Laura claimed a last-minute meeting and stayed in town. When Daniel returned, he saw that her clothes in the laundry basket were folded differently. The bedroom sheets had been changed, smelling of fabric softener they hadn't used. The bathroom towel was still damp, but in a different place than usual. He began to see the details like pieces of a cruel puzzle. And even in the face of all these signs, he still hesitated. Not out of naivete, but out of fear of losing the only thing that still made sense. Because admitting it would mean accepting that she was no longer there. And that hurt more than any betrayal. Laura, for her part, felt the weight of what she had been building. The man she was exchanging messages with was an old colleague from events. They had bonded after an awards ceremony, and initially, everything seemed harmless. Talking about projects, exchanging references, joking about clients. But there was a tension lingering there, a kind of magnetism she pretended not to notice. And one day, she gave in. It wasn't planned, it wasn't romantic, it was confusing, and then, immediately, uncomfortable. But instead of stopping, she kept going. Because in the other man, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time with Daniel, desire. The kind of gaze that made her feel important, interesting, alive. Laura hadn't fallen in love. She had simply lost herself. And in the midst of this loss, she began to believe she could still maintain both, the comfort of stability with Daniel and the excitement of newness with the other. Everything changed one night. It was Daniel's birthday. Laura had forgotten. She only remembered when she saw a notification from a mutual friend on her phone. She returned home with a hastily purchased cake, with rehearsed words and a forced smile. But Daniel didn't react. He simply thanked her, blew out the candle, and ate in silence. That was the night he knew, with all the unspoken words, that he had lost. And that the woman sitting across from him was no longer his. Days later, the invitation to another industry party arrived. Laura insisted they go together, perhaps as an attempt to make up for forgetting the anniversary. Daniel accepted. He needed to see. He needed to see with his own eyes the truth his heart was already screaming. They arrived together, smiling for the photographers, exchanging measured words. Inside, the atmosphere was the same as always, clinking glasses, ambient music, quick conversations. Laura mingled among the acquaintances, Daniel stayed on the sidelines. When she saw him cross the room toward the bar, she noticed the look. The other's gaze. The man was there. And when they greeted each other, Daniel saw it. It wasn't the touch, nor the words. It was the time. The time it took Laura's eyes to move away. It was the way she laughed, the way she touched his shoulder, the way she leaned in slightly to hear a random phrase. Daniel knew. He knew in that second. And what he felt wasn't anger. It was the end. She left the salon without making a fuss. She walked to the sidewalk, took a deep breath, and then saw them. The other man was beside her, his hands too close, their bodies too aligned. When Laura saw him, she froze. She lowered her eyes. She said nothing. She didn't even try to explain. And it was then that Daniel spoke to her, for the last time. He said it calmly, with pain piercing his throat, "You chose. I choose to leave." He returned home alone, as if grieving. It wasn't the end of a marriage. It was the end of a story he believed in alone. And that very morning, he filed for divorce. Not on impulse. But out of dignity. Because when love is broken and respect is gone, staying is the worst form of loneliness. But what Daniel didn't yet know was that betrayal, as painful as it was, wasn't the cruelest part of the story. Because what would come next, what would be revealed in their final reunion, would be the true point of no return. Time passed with the weight of someone who doesn't ask for permission. Daniel rebuilt his life silently, unhurriedly and quietly, like someone cleaning up their own wreckage with their hands still bleeding. He didn't seek revenge, nor did he make a spectacle of his pain. He simply moved on. He moved apartments, cut ties, and rebuilt his routines. Few knew what had truly happened, and he preferred it that way. What was intimate remained hidden like a wound healing inside, where no one could see. It took him months to be able to look back without feeling his chest collapse. But one day, upon waking, he realized that the scent of absence no longer filled the room, and that the silence, once painful, now tasted of peace. It was during this time, between one morning and the next, that he met Sophia. She didn't appear like a whirlwind, nor as a refuge. She came like a steady breeze, without promising cures. She worked with literature and was well acquainted with the silences of unspoken words. They talked about everything and nothing. And it was precisely in this absence of expectations that Daniel found space to breathe. Sophia didn't want to fix him, just accompany him as he reconnected with himself. Over time, they became a presence in each other's lives. Nothing was immediate. It was a careful construction, where each gesture was a conscious choice to be there, to remain. When they finally committed to their relationship, Daniel felt something inside him had been remade. Not as before, but in a new, serene, whole way. On the other side, Laura was dealing with her own brokenness. After the divorce, the man she had let herself be seduced by disappeared in less than 2 weeks. No explanation, no messages, no trace. At first, she tried to convince herself she didn't care. But little by little, she realized she didn't miss him. She missed Daniel. The way he cared, the way he looked at her, the comfortable silence that existed between them. She began to understand what she had lost. And when she realized it, regret arrived like a slow poison, corrupting her days one by one. She tried to contact him, of course. She sent messages, emails, even a handwritten letter. All ignored. The only response she received was silence. And that hurt more than any words. Months later, she ran into Daniel again at a creative event. He was different. Thinner, his gaze lighter. When they met, she hesitated. He, in turn, nodded politely but without affection. They chatted briefly, about small talk, about work, about things that didn't matter. But Laura insisted, asking to meet another time. She said she needed to talk about things she'd been holding back for a long time. And, for the first time, Daniel agreed. They arranged to meet for coffee on a gray Tuesday, in a discreet place, as if no one should witness it. They sat across from each other. She was visibly anxious. He was restrained. After a few minutes of tense silence, she began to speak. She apologized, explaining that she had lost her way, that she had been weak, that she didn't know what she was doing. Daniel listened without interrupting. He just watched, like someone watching a movie whose ending is already known. When she finished, he calmly said that he had forgiven her. Not for her, but for himself. That he held no grudges, but also no longer held any feelings. Laura was silent for a few seconds, then murmured that she still loved him. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath and said that there was someone in his life now. Someone who walked beside him without confusing presence with possession. Laura swallowed hard, tried to hide her pain, but failed. And it was at that moment that the true impact of the loss hit her. He was no longer hers. Not even in her memory. 2 weeks later, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, she saw him on television. A cultural program was reporting on an artistic inclusion project that was gaining international notoriety. Daniel was the founder. The same project he'd dreamed of undertaking for years, the same one that, at the time of their marriage, she'd called an illusion, a waste of time, something cute, but useless. He was there, being recognized, admired, respected. And he wasn't alone. By his side was Sophia. The woman who, now, helped him build what Laura had once destroyed with words and indifference. The camera showed them both smiling, exchanging knowing glances, as they spoke passionately about their work. There was no acting involved. It was clear that there was genuine affection between them, a true partnership. Laura felt the ground disappear from under her. She turned off the television and remained silent for hours. That night, she cried like she had never cried before. Because she realized that what she had destroyed wasn't just a relationship. It was the chance to experience something great with someone who always believed in her, even when she herself didn't. At the end of that month, a charity event brought together old colleagues and partners from the events and design industry. Laura was invited. She knew Daniel would be there, she knew she'd probably see Sophia too. She considered refusing, but something compelled her to go. She arrived early, stood in a corner, watching. And when they arrived, he felt his chest tighten. They were holding hands. They were laughing together. He introduced her proudly. Laura approached after a while, her steps firm, her heart pounding. When he saw her, he greeted her with the same calm look as always, but now there was a line there, a line that would never be crossed again. They spoke briefly. She praised the project, he thanked her. Sophia was cordial and polite, but with the firmness of someone who knew exactly where she stood. When Laura tried to bring up the past, Daniel simply smiled gently and said he preferred to focus on the present. And that's when, mid-conversation, she blurted out what she never should have said, and what would change everything. He said, almost unconsciously, as if he didn't mince words, "You know, sometimes I think, if I had supported you in that dream back then, maybe I would be by your side today." Sophia, who had remained silent until then, looked at Laura with a calm, steady gaze. Daniel took a deep breath, lowered his eyes for a second, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with an old, but still pulsating, pain. He said that, in fact, she not only didn't support him, but made a point of sabotaging every attempt he made to step outside his comfort zone. That he remembered exactly the day she purposely tore up a draft of his presentation, calling it childish. That he remembered the night she, upon learning of an important meeting, scheduled a dinner with her parents at the same time, forcing him to choose. And that, when he chose the job, she spent weeks treating him coldly. That for years, she had been the main obstacle between him and his dream. But that, out of love, he had accepted. And that perhaps this was his biggest mistake, confusing love with submission. Laura tried to argue, deny it, say she didn't remember those situations. But Daniel continued. He said that the day he started the project with Sophia, he cried alone with joy. Because for the first time, someone looked at him and said, "Go, I'll help you." He said he never wanted someone perfect. He just wanted someone who wouldn't put him down. And now that he had that, he would never settle for anything less. Laura remained silent. Sophia then gently touched Daniel's arm and excused herself. He walked away with her, leaving Laura there, with the bitter taste of what would never be hers again. She stood there for long minutes, until someone called her in the distance. But she didn't answer. Because in that moment, the truth was too clear to ignore, the biggest mistake of her life wasn't the betrayal. It was turning her back on the dream of the one who loved her. And now, that dream was alive, blossoming, but not with her. Laura couldn't sleep that night. After the conversation, after hearing everything Daniel had kept silent for so long, she lay with her eyes open, reliving every word, every expression on his face, every pause filled with suppressed disappointment. The memory of the serene way Sophia held him by the arm, how he looked at her with genuine gratitude before walking away, hurt more than his absence. It was the certainty that there was no more room for regret, that what was broken wasn't just cracked, it was irreparable. For the first time, Laura understood that the forgiveness he had given her wasn't a bridge to a new beginning, it was a full stop that came with respect but no return. In the following days, she tried to go about her daily routine as if nothing had happened, but everything seemed filled with echoes. She began to see Daniel in everything, in a colleague's tone of voice, in a book recommendation, in the taste of a wine. Small memories surfaced without warning, each one like a silent blow. At night, she found herself rereading old conversations she'd never had the courage to delete. Simple messages, without grand declarations, but filled with a silent love that now seemed irretrievable. In an attempt to regain some control, she decided to write a letter. Not with the intention of winning him back, but because she felt the need to free herself from what still weighed on her. She wanted, somehow, to give him back the recognition he'd never given her. She wrote for days, tearing out pages, starting paragraphs over. The final letter was sincere, painful, written with the vulnerability of someone finally acknowledging their own mistakes without hiding behind excuses. When she finished, she put it in an envelope and left it at the reception of the art institute Daniel had founded. She didn't sign it, didn't include a phone number. She simply wrote, "Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in you." And she left, without waiting for a reply. She didn't want a reply. She wanted release. Meanwhile, Daniel's life moved at a new pace. The social project was gaining momentum, receiving international support, expanding its reach into forgotten neighborhoods of the city. He spoke in interviews with the same calmness as always, but now there was something different. There was a glow. A glow that didn't come from fame or success, but from the feeling of finally being in tune with who he was. Sophia was by his side through every achievement. Not just as an emotional partner, but as an active collaborator on the project. The two formed a silent, solid team. When they looked at each other, it wasn't with idolatry or dependence, it was with partnership. And that made all the difference. Despite his apparent calm, Daniel felt that his conversation with Laura had left its mark. Not of hurt, but of reflection. What he had buried so deeply, what he had left in the past as something overcome, now returned with the power of true closure. For the first time, he felt he could look back without carrying anything else. It was as if he had finally returned the pain to where it came from, as if, by saying everything he needed to, he had freed up space to live the present fully. Weeks later, Sophia invited him to walk in the park where they used to go at the beginning of their relationship. It was a cool afternoon, the kind of day that brings tranquility even without saying anything. They walked in silence for a while until she stopped, looked at him, and, with the sincerity that always guided them both, asked if he still carried anything from the story with Laura. Daniel took a few seconds to answer. He looked at the ground, thought, and then said no. That what he carried now was gratitude for having managed to leave that relationship with dignity, and even more so, for having found in her, in Sophia, everything he previously believed he didn't deserve. She smiled, took his hand, and they continued walking. The answer was enough. A few days later, a major urban art festival was announced, one of the largest in the country, and Daniel's Institute was invited to present a panel. The event would bring together figures from the arts, culture, and entertainment world. It was a unique opportunity to showcase the project's true impact. Daniel was honored, but also hesitant. The magnitude of the event put him back in the spotlight of people from the past. But he decided to accept. It was time to showcase what he had built, not out of vanity, but out of genuine pride. The presentation was scheduled for the weekend. On the day of the event, the venue was packed. The works exhibited by the Institute's students drew attention, sparked conversation, and stirred emotions. Daniel walked among the works with Sophia at his side, explaining the process and telling stories of the participants. Then, as he turned a corner, he spotted Laura. She was alone, standing in front of an interactive installation that spoke about time and what it takes away. She didn't notice him right away. She was absorbed, reading one of the phrases posted on the wall, "Love doesn't die. It only changes address." Daniel didn't deviate from his path. He stopped a few meters behind, watching. Sophia noticed, squeezed his hand, and said she'd meet him outside. He nodded. When Laura turned, their eyes met again. She took a small step forward, her expression uncertain, somewhere between an apology and an attempt at casualness. He smiled serenely and approached. They talked for a few minutes. She praised his work, asked how the institute was doing, and spoke with genuine admiration. Daniel thanked her respectfully. And then she did something unexpected. She took a small notebook from her pocket and handed it to him. Inside was a copy of the letter she'd left weeks earlier, with a handwritten note, "I don't expect anything back. I just needed you to know." Daniel read it silently. He put the paper away without saying anything. Laura looked into his eyes and said, her voice breaking, that she hoped he would be very happy. That Sophia was an admirable woman, and that he was exactly where he should be. And before he could respond, she continued, "I destroyed our love long before I betrayed you. Today I understand that the betrayal was just the consequence of everything I had been killing within us. You loved me until the end. And I only realized that after the end." Daniel didn't say a word. He just nodded, then gently placed his hand on her shoulder. That gesture was enough. There was nothing more to say. Hours later, back at the apartment, Daniel showed the letter to Sophia. He read it aloud, without changing his tone. When he finished, she simply asked if it changed anything for him. He denied it with a brief smile. He said that what he feared most in the past was being betrayed by someone who knew his dreams. But what strengthened him most now was being with someone who walked alongside him in those same dreams, without erasing them, without diminishing them, without using them against him. Sophia hugged him, and in that embrace, Daniel felt something he couldn't describe, a sense of belonging that didn't come from dependence, but from truth. The following week, the institute received a new sponsor. The project would now grow even further, reaching public schools and remote communities. During the announcement ceremony, Daniel was invited to give a speech. He took the stage with calm hands, a peaceful heart. He spoke about art, transformation, and reconstruction. And in one passage, he said, "Sometimes, what tears us apart is exactly what shows us what we're made of. Pain doesn't define us, but what we do with it does." In the audience, Sophia applauded with pride in her eyes. Elsewhere in the auditorium, Laura watched from afar. She wasn't there by invitation, but by choice. She knew she needed to see for herself what he had built. And in that moment, amidst applause and suppressed tears, she understood that not all longing is a plea for someone back. Sometimes, it's just confirmation that you left the best version of yourself, and didn't know how to get back in time. That night, after the ceremony, was not silent. Not in sound, but in everything she carried. Laura returned home feeling heavy in her heart, but for the first time, that weight wasn't the weight of wanting to regain what she'd lost, it was the weight of understanding, of accepting, of facing herself. She walked through the empty rooms of the apartment with her heels still on, her eyes fixed on every piece of furniture, as if she were in a place that was no longer hers. She sat at the kitchen table, pulled out a glass of wine, and stood there, still, trying to remember the last time she'd felt truly alive, not just busy, desired, valued by appearances. When was it that she traded truth for the glitter of a passing novelty? When did she mistake excitement for love? And why was she never able to see that real love, the love that builds, is made of things she'd ignored for years? Across town, Daniel and Sophia were also awake. Sitting on the porch floor, blankets draped over their legs, they spoke little. There was a calm between them that required no words. He had read the letter, recounted the conversation, recounted Laura's looks, and she simply listened. Not with judgment, but with genuine listening. Sophia knew that Daniel's past was a map of crooked paths, deep scars, and memories that still sometimes hurt. And for that very reason, she didn't ache for Laura. She didn't compare herself, she didn't place herself in the position of a rival. She knew who she was, knew her place. And more than that, she knew who Daniel was now, and who he would never be again. The institute was growing. More communities began to join the project. Children who had never picked up a paintbrush were now painting murals that caught the attention of critics. Daniel was no longer just a creator, he was now a symbol of reconstruction. And even with all the visibility he gained, he kept his feet on the ground. He declined invitations that strayed from the essence of the project, refused sensationalist interviews, and insisted on being present in every class, in every conversation with the young people. He didn't see himself as an example, but as a consequence, someone who used pain as a foundation for something greater. And that was the difference between him and many who crossed his path. He didn't want fame. He wanted purpose. One day, Laura was invited to a lecture on image and career restructuring. The event was geared toward women in transition, professionals seeking a fresh start after mistakes, traumas, or questionable choices. She accepted the invitation hesitantly, knowing it would be a confrontational environment. During her speech, for the first time, she didn't use rehearsed phrases. She said she wasn't there to teach anyone how to start over, but to share how she nearly destroyed everything she was by not knowing how to value what she had. She spoke about choices, about vanity, about the desire to be desired at any cost, even if it meant ignoring the true love she had already received. Some women applauded, others wept. But most listened in silence. It was the kind of speech that doesn't inspire, but rather warns. A warning that some choices cannot be undone, no matter how much regret there is. In the following weeks, Laura began a kind of personal journey. She returned to therapy, resumed old projects she had put aside, and began frequenting spaces she had previously avoided for fear of confronting what she had become. She began to listen more and speak less. Building relationships with more honesty. She didn't try to erase the past, but began to give it meaning. She understood that living in the attempt to reclaim what she lost was a cruel way of remaining trapped in guilt. So she decided to do things differently. Not for Daniel, nor for Sophia, nor for those watching from afar. But for herself. Daniel, for his part, was unaware of these changes. And he didn't need to be. His life was different now. The project, Sophia, the young artists, the students who arrived with fear and left with a sparkle in their eyes, this was the universe he inhabited. He had found his mission, and in it, he found peace. Sometimes he remembered Laura, yes. Not with pain, but with a slight longing of someone who had been happy for a time. He didn't deny the love he'd shared with her, but he knew that love had died from within. And, even though there had been good moments, there was no room for return. Because those who have learned to be truly loved no longer accept crumbs of emotion. A dilemma, however, began to quietly take shape. One of the brands that wanted to sponsor the institute proposed turning the project story into a documentary miniseries. And in the plot, it was impossible to avoid mentioning the beginning of it all, the denial he suffered, the former relationship, the abandonment, the rebuilding. It was a chance to show the world how he had overcome what had nearly destroyed him. But it also meant opening wounds many didn't know existed. When he received the script, he read it carefully. It was all there. True. But raw. It had the power to impact, but it also carried the risk of exposing people who were now seeking to repair what they had once destroyed. He spoke to Sophia, as he always did before making any decision. She read the script, remained silent, and then said that, although the world had much to learn from that story, perhaps it would be greater to continue telling the transformation without exposing the ruin. That true greatness lay in continuing to be an example without using anyone as a villain. Daniel reflected for days. Not out of fear. But because he knew that what he chose would say a lot about who he was now. In the end, he decided to adjust the script. He removed names and personal details, keeping the focus on the rebuilding process, the young people, and the future. When the project aired, it had national repercussions. He received messages from all over the country, stories of people who decided not to give up on their dreams. At no point did he need to name the people who made him bleed. Because those who truly build don't need to destroy anyone to rise up. And this, perhaps, was the most powerful gesture of all. Laura watched the documentary alone. Every word Daniel said resonated. There were no hints, no exposition. But she knew. She knew he was there, even if silently. And she cried. Not out of anger, nor out of hurt. She cried because, by choosing not to use her as an excuse for his pain, Daniel had shown her what genuine love was, the kind that doesn't hurt, even when it has reason to. There, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea cooling in her hands, she understood that sometimes the greatest punishment is seeing someone blossom in the very place where you prevented them from growing. The days went by. The project continued. Daniel and Sophia began talking about expanding to other states. They considered opening a traveling headquarters, a kind of mobile workshop that would bring art and education to more isolated areas. It was ambitious, but feasible. And more than that, it was necessary. The energy between them grew with the same lightness as always. There were no grandiose promises, just plans made with their feet on the ground and their eyes fixed on the same horizon. Meanwhile, Laura began working at a support center for women undergoing personal reconstruction. She used her own story as a listening tool, not as an example of overcoming, but as a warning. She spoke frankly about ego, pride, and choices that, even made in silence, leave lasting repercussions. And each time a woman rose from rock bottom with dignity, Laura felt that, even though she couldn't erase her mistakes, she could transform guilt into purpose. They both moved on. In different directions, but with the same lucidity. And deep down, they knew there was still a chapter unwritten. A final encounter that wasn't necessary, but that, if it happened, would carry the weight and silence of everything unsaid before. And perhaps that moment was closer than they imagined. Some stories don't end in the final chapter, but in the details that follow. In the silences that mature. In the reunions that were unplanned, but that time insists on stitching together with precision. Daniel had completely devoted himself to the Institute's new phase, which was now preparing for its largest undertaking since its creation, a national tour, with stops in 6 capitals and artistic interventions in marginalized areas. The project was being sponsored by an international foundation, and so he and Sophia spent their days between meetings, planning sessions, interviews, and training sessions with the new team of educators and curators. It was exhausting, but it was exactly where he wanted to be. For the first time, he felt that the place he stood wasn't borrowed, nor tolerated, it was a place earned. Nothing there was by chance, much less by luck. It was sweat, pain transformed into purpose, and love reciprocated. Sophia grew beside him like a tree that, instead of competing for light, offered shade. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Laura reviewed her life through the least flattering lens she had ever used. Looking back was now part of a daily exercise. No longer to dwell, but to understand the root of her choices. With every conversation she had with a hurt woman, with every account of regret, abandonment, or devaluation, she saw fragments of herself. And, oddly enough, it strengthened her. She began to structure an independent course focused on the emotional and professional reconstruction of women in life transition. Without romanticizing a fresh start, without embellishing guilt. With the truth she knew firsthand. And this project, born of ruin, began to take shape. Soon, she was invited to present a preview at a symposium on social innovation that would bring together leaders of initiatives from across the country. What she didn't know was that Daniel had also been invited to open the event with a talk on cultural impact through art. The morning of the symposium arrived with gray skies and a humid air. The convention center was bustling, packed with people from different regions, each carrying their own stories, causes, and scars. Daniel and Sophia arrived early, greeted the organizing team, and had coffee in a discreet corner. Laura arrived soon after, alone, with a black briefcase under her arm and her eyes focused. Their first eye contact happened by chance, as she was climbing the stairs from the hall and saw him in the distance, standing next to a panel with photographs of murals produced by the Institute. Daniel saw her too. The look didn't last long. A second longer than necessary, a second less than expected. They both simply nodded, with the sobriety of those who no longer need to explain anything. The auditorium gradually filled, and when the lights dimmed, Daniel was called to the stage. He spoke for a little over 20 minutes. He used no slides or videos, just words. He spoke about the role of art as a tool for reclaiming identity, the importance of safe spaces for young people in vulnerable contexts, and how active listening can save lives that previously seemed doomed to oblivion. There was a standing ovation. But what remained was the silence after his final sentence. A dense silence, the kind that transforms the air around him. When he stepped off the stage, he passed a few meters from Laura. She said nothing. She just looked at him. And in that look, there was everything that cannot be said. Later, after the event's collective lunch, she was called for her presentation. She took the stage with a firm step, unlike the woman who, months earlier, hesitated even to participate in discussion groups. She presented her project clearly, with data, with stories that immediately resonated. But it was at the end, when she departed from the script, that she truly captured the audience's attention. She explained that the project had been born of emotional failure. That only after losing something precious did she understand the value of listening, of valuing others, of mutual respect. She didn't mention names, didn't point fingers, but left the rawness of responsibility hanging in the air. She ended her speech with a phrase that made the audience freeze for a moment: some people change the world. Others destroy their own world without realizing it. And when they realize it, it's too late to rebuild with the same hands. As they stepped off the stage, the symposium coordinator approached them both and proposed that they participate in a panel discussion together at the end of the day. The idea was to address new beginnings and goals based on different experiences. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds. Sophia, noticing the tension in his face, simply said, "If you feel you should, go. But only if it means continuing to be you." He agreed. Laura, in turn, accepted immediately. Perhaps because, deep down, she always knew this moment would come. That time would somehow prepare the right stage for both of them to finally close a story that still bled in silent layers. The debate took place in a more intimate room, with chairs arranged in a circle. The audience was smaller but more attentive. The moderator began with simple questions, then delved deeper into the topics. When it was Daniel's turn to talk about the biggest challenges he faced when starting the project, he took a deep breath before answering. He said the biggest one was believing that something beautiful could exist after being broken. That, in the beginning, everything seemed too small, too fragile, almost ridiculous. But that, over time, he understood that it wasn't the size of the project that mattered, but the size of the delivery. Laura listened to everything with her eyes fixed on him. And when asked what motivated her today, she answered bluntly. She said it was pain. That transforming it into something useful was the least she could do after everything she had caused, to others and to herself. At the end of the panel, as the audience began to disperse, the moderator invited them for one last photo of the speakers together. Daniel and Laura stood side by side. It was quick. A click. An instant. And when the flashes stopped, they stood there. The noise around them seemed distant. Laura called his name, softly, almost as if testing her right to still be able to do so. Daniel simply nodded. She then said she wanted to thank him for being spared that public narrative. That she truly hoped his life would be long, full of color, just like the murals now being born from the hands of the young people he inspired. He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, saw unapologetic sincerity. He replied that she, too, deserved a new path. But that sometimes the paths we choose aren't the ones that lead us back. And that it was okay. Laura smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She said she knew. She said that now, when she closed her eyes, she no longer saw what she'd lost, but what she'd ceased to be. And that this was the greatest wound. But also the greatest motivation. He said nothing more. He simply touched her shoulder briefly and walked to where Sophia was waiting for him, standing with her hands clasped and the same firm gaze as always. They walked out side by side, exchanging few words, as if sharing everything even in silence. Laura stayed there for another minute. Not out of attachment, but out of respect for the process itself. That night, returning home, he sat down at his computer and began writing. Not a letter, not a rant. He wrote the first draft of his course manual. Each chapter began with a story. Each story was a part of himself. And at the end of the file, he left a simple dedication, to those who taught me the value of silence. And to those who showed me that starting over is different from going back. When he saved the document, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness. It was peace. On the other side, Daniel was packing his suitcase for the Institute's mobile unit's first official trip. They would leave the following week. Sophia watched as he organized everything with precision. At one point, she approached and hugged him from behind, pressing her face against his back. She told him he had grown so much. He smiled. He said he was just being who he always was, but that now, finally, someone saw it. She held him tighter. And in that moment, in the silence of the room, their story found its true form. Not as a tale of revenge, nor as a forced redemption. But as the narrative of someone who chose to move on without forgetting, to forgive without erasing, and to love without repeating the mistakes of the past. On the day the Institute's mobile unit set off on its first journey into the countryside, Daniel remained silent the entire drive. The sun was low on the horizon, reflecting off the van's windows as a constant reminder that something new was beginning. Sophia, sitting beside him, didn't ask any questions. She had already learned that there were times when his silence was more eloquent than any answer. He simply held a notebook in his lap and watched the landscapes pass by the window, his eyes fixed, his mind wandering on paths that went far beyond the roads. With each kilometer, he seemed to move away not only from the city but from all the memories that, for so long, had prevented him from breathing fully. He was at peace, but a peace that came from the mature acceptance that some scars don't disappear, they just stop hurting. In the months that followed, the project gained intense momentum. The two traveled through villages, forgotten communities, spaces neglected by government and the dominant culture. They brought paint, words, instruments, tools, and, above all, listening. They listened to stories of young people who had never dreamed because they didn't even know they could. They listened to mothers raising children alone, women who had lost everything, men who had carried guilt on their shoulders since childhood. Daniel, with his firm and sensitive manner, didn't just teach, he transformed. And Sophia, with her clarity and dedication, became the essential support of the mission. At each stop, they left a piece of themselves. And with each return home, they returned more whole. Laura followed from afar. Every now and then, she'd see a new bulletin board on social media, a new class graduating, a new article in the press highlighting the Institute's social impact. She didn't like it, didn't comment, but she read everything. She observed it like someone reading a book that no longer participates in the story, but knows every page that preceded the turning point by heart. The support center she had founded also began to gain notoriety. She became a reference among emotional restructuring programs aimed at women. Her courses were sought after by women of all ages, from diverse backgrounds. And Laura, more than ever, was committed to the mission of guiding, welcoming, and rebuilding. It was a different version of herself, less impulsive, less vain, more empathetic. But even though professional growth filled some of the void, there were nights when I still woke startled by the sound of a memory. With the weight of a what if that could no longer be answered. In one of these courses, a young woman asked her if it was possible to undo a betrayal. Laura remained silent for a moment. Then she replied that forgiveness can even pave the way for respect, but that love, when broken with emotional violence, rarely returns. She said that starting over is possible, but reversing it is not. And that the hardest part isn't being forgiven, it's being able to forgive yourself. After that, she began to include this reflection in all her training courses. She taught that no one cheats by accident, and that every choice has a price. But that it was also possible to transform through repentance, as long as one accepted the consequences. Years passed. The Institute became international. Daniel began to be invited to conferences abroad, training new community leaders in other languages, with other cultures, but with the same dreams. He was named cultural ambassador for an international organization. His career became an academic reference. And even with all this repercussion, he remained the same man, discreet, present, true to his purpose. He and Sophia formalized their union in an intimate ceremony in a cultural center surrounded by their own students and staff. There was no luxury. But there was truth in every look, in every word exchanged. Laura received the invitation, not as a formality, but as a symbol. She read it, thanked it deeply, but did not attend. She understood that some things are honored at a distance. One day, on a random afternoon, while walking through a square she'd often spent in her early years with Daniel, Laura came across a woman sitting on a bench reading a book. She recognized the face. It was Sophia. The two exchanged glances. Laura hesitated. But after a few seconds, she approached and sat next to her, without asking permission, as if recognizing that life sometimes presents these scenes so they can no longer escape. There was no tension. Just two universes that had already intersected, sitting side by side, in silence. Sophia was the one who spoke first. She said that time makes us understand things that, at the right moment, would seem too cruel. Laura agreed. And for a few minutes, they shared the absence of resentment, the weariness of pain, and the maturity of someone who learned the hard way that love is not invincible. When Laura got up to leave, she turned to Sophia and said that Daniel deserved everything he was experiencing now. And that, somehow, she was relieved to have been replaced not by someone better, but by someone who knew how to care for what she didn't. Sophia didn't answer. She just smiled. And in that smile was the end of a cycle. Laura continued to work hard at the center. She didn't remarry, but she rebuilt family ties, reconnected with lost friends, and reconnected with versions of herself that had been dormant since long before everything happened. She never again became involved with anyone with the same intensity. And perhaps that was her conscious choice, to preserve what was left of herself. Daniel, meanwhile, continued expanding the project, now with plans to open a popular university focused on art and innovation for low-income youth. It was a distant dream, but not impossible. And now, he no longer dreamed alone. He had a partner by his side, he had a voice, he had a foundation. And more than that, he had peace. And if there's one justice that time never fails to mete out, it's to show, subtly and irrefutably, that the affections we throw away carelessly never return with the same color. Laura learned this. And moved on. Daniel knew this. And never returned. If you've come this far, with a heavy heart, you may have realized that this story is more than a tale of betrayal. It's a mirror of choices. It shows how disloyalty doesn't just destroy a relationship, it destroys trust, admiration, the emotional home two people build. Sometimes, betrayal doesn't come in the form of a stolen kiss, but in small actions that ignore, diminish, and silence the other. And when loyalty is broken, even if forgiveness exists, love almost never survives disrespect. Here on the channel, we believe in true love. We believe in daily building, listening, and mutual support. And we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. If this story touched you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments. What was the moment that impacted you the most? What would you have done differently in Laura's or Daniel's shoes? Subscribe to the channel to follow other stories like this, stories that, even though they're fiction, carry truths that many live in silence. And never forget, those who trade the certain for the uncertain may experience a moment of pleasure, but they almost always lose a love that will never return. And when they realize what they threw away, they may find only silence where their heart once stood.